Welcome to the Love Letters to Our Bodies podcast. I'm your host, Gwendolyn Mitchell, founder and CEO of MOYO Institute and lifelong spiritual seeker and energy worker, here for thoughtful conversations about health, healing, and happiness by, for, and about Black and African American women. Disclaimer, the Love Letters to Our Bodies podcast does not provide medical advice. The opinions, experiences, and insights shared are for informational purposes only. Nothing shared in this podcast is intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other healthcare provider. Don't disregard or delay seeking it because of what you've heard on this podcast. Thank you. Are you ready? Let's dive in. Welcome to Love Letters to Our Bodies, conversations on health, healing, and happiness. I'm your host, Gwen Mitchell. In this podcast, we will dive into topics that relate to our well-being. We're living at a time when there's so much information at our fingertips that can help us to successfully navigate the path to our health and happiness, avoiding the obstacles. And I want to make sure that my sisters know about them and to make it easier for my sisters to benefit from this information. This is something that I feel passionate about. A little bit about me. I'm a mother of two sons, Marcus and Joe, and their partners, and Nana to Marley, Maya, and Cassius. I was born and grew up in Oakland, California, lived for many years on the East Coast in the DC metropolitan area. I worked for several years as a manager in local government, and even while doing so, I had this feeling that I wanted to do more for humanity. I actually had to do more, so I became a spiritual seeker. I was the first African American to be initiated in the U.S. as a Reiki master in 1990, as a Reiki master in the Usui system of natural healing. And if you don't know what Reiki is, it's a healing system that is akin to energy medicine. I treated people who suffered from a range of challenges, from carpal tunnel to fibroids to cramps to complications from reconstructive surgery, people who were struggling with diabetes and a lot of different conditions, including HIV. And that whole process opened me and propelled me forward on my spiritual journey. And over the time, my focus has shifted away from symptoms to causes. And the path that opened up before me was a recognition that I was to be my first and foremost client. You know that old saying, physician, heal thyself. Not a physician, and need to make a disclaimer here that I'm sharing my opinions, my experiences. You'll be hearing from guests who will be sharing their experiences and their expertise. And that if you have a medical condition, feel free to reach out to your physician for advice about what's appropriate for you. We are not a substitute for that, nor do we claim to have any special relationship to medical information. That's a mouthful. Okay, so my first task was to really heal myself. And in doing so, I began to become more and more aware of imbalances in the life and how they are connected to imbalances in our thinking process. So over the years, this seeking continued, and most recently, I moved away from focusing on hands-on healing to really focusing more on consciousness. And I founded a nonprofit organization, MOYO Institute. And MOYO's task is to offer heart-centered educational experiences that promote well-being, promote creativity, promote connection, and promote oneness. So we have been involved for the past 2 years in a project called Love Letters to Our Bodies. And this is actually the beginning of the story for the Love Letters to Our Bodies podcast. And these workshops were for African American women who were journeying with cancer. And they focused on really helping women to see the relationship between mind, body, and spirit, and also to give them tools to support them and very, very simple things that could be done to support them to have more energy, to assimilate medications better or food better, to lower the levels of stress and anxiety. And this is the beginning of what has now led to the Love Letters to Our Bodies podcast. But we will be exploring a range of issues throughout this podcast. But season one, we're going to start with the focus on cancer with women thrivers, women who are resilient, who really will be sharing their stories. And we'll be focusing on some of the options that are available for people in terms of alternative and integrative medicine. And also things that we can do with respect to diet and nutrition, things that we need to understand about the products that we use and how they're affecting our health, and simple ways to begin to track what's happening with you and your health as you move throughout your day. Some people have asked why cancer for African American women, and cancer is something that doesn't have any respect for race or gender. And so why not really focus on everyone? And my response to that is that they're correct. Cancer is something that really affects everyone without concern for gender or race. But what we know from the statistics is that overall, Black people have poorer health outcomes. And when it comes to cancer, that's no exception. We know, for instance, that African Americans experience more illness and worse outcomes and premature death compared to whites. And these are findings of the American Cancer Society. And also that Black women are 40% more likely to die from breast cancer than white women and are twice as likely to die if they are younger than 50. We've learned through our research that as you go down the various ways in which cancer presents in the body, through many of them, the impact on Black folks is more severe. And even if we have lower rates of the cancer, often our outcome is worse than other cohorts. So we're focusing on Black women for that reason. And maybe we'll focus on other people at some point. But right now, we felt it was important to create a space for us by us and a place where people can feel free to, in our workshops, feel free to really talk about their body image, the kinds of messages they received growing up and that were not affirming. And we know, for instance, that the traumas and the conditioning, the programming, the repeated kind of messages that we hear in our formative years really show up later in our health and well-being. So we're bringing this important message and important work to help our sisters, and they will help their families. So I almost hesitate to recite the statistics because I believe that what we think and feel actually impacts us. And I don't want us to be entrained to think about the negative, to think about the worst possible outcomes. I mean, really, what I've discovered over the past couple of years of doing these workshops is that really there's a tremendous amount of resilience, that cancer is not a death sentence, that there are new treatments coming on board every day, and people are living longer and longer and healthier as well. So while we will give the proper concern and respect to the fact that this is an important issue, it is an important health issue. It does impact the African American community at a higher rate and more devastating than others. We won't get caught in those numbers because I believe that as we begin to sort of grow our consciousness, as we begin to really take our health into our hands and do the kinds of things that we can do, that are ours to do, and for ours to know that we do have an opportunity to really change those outcomes. One of the leading causes of illness is stress. And being Black in America, actually being Black anywhere except maybe in some prospering African countries, is a stressful situation. And it is the source of chronic stress. And what we know is that there's so many factors like the unequal and inequitable treatment by law enforcement, the lack of access to resources, and discriminatory practices by financial institutions, under-resourced communities, differential treatment by health practitioners, differential treatment by employers, and the list goes on and on and on. And so when we were going through this huge mourning as a community around the death of George Floyd and the many others that happened in proximity to that, we actually began to recognize that being bombarded by these repeated images of trauma were actually re-traumatizing African American people, and that we needed to take steps to reclaim our health and exercise sovereignty over our thinking process. So at that time, I wrote a blog post called Meditation and Self-Care, a Radical Life-Affirming Response to Racism. And I mentioned in that article that we know, for instance, based on the research that's been done by a couple of Nobel Prize winners, Elizabeth Blackburn and Carolyn Greider, that chromosomes are protected by telomeres. In a way, you can think of it as little, if you look at a shoelace, for instance, the plastic tips on the end, those caps on the end that keep the lace together, that's what telomeres do for our chromosomes. And when we're bombarded by stress, we actually see a shortening, a fraying of those telomeres and a shortening of those telomeres. They are protected by an enzyme called telomerase, which counteracts the damages. What we know about chronic stress is that they're predictors of early death. We know that the shorter the telomere length, that aging happens more rapidly. And when there are multiple exposures to chronic stress and adversity in early life, it has a large effect, huge effect on our overall health and well-being. And one of the major causes of this injury is racism, and racism in this society. And there was a study conducted by Dr. David Che, an associate professor at Auburn University, on how changes in racial discrimination affect the telomeres over time. And they really looked at African Americans over a 10-year period, and they determined that there was faster aging among African Americans at that time who reported more racial discrimination. And this study is available at the National Institutes of Health Library. It's called the Auburn Study, if you want to dig deeper. The study adds evidence that discrimination contributes to accelerated health declines among African Americans, and it has an impact on the biological systems of the body, and that actually result in telomere attrition. The Love Letters to Our Bodies podcast is sponsored by MOYO Institute, Incorporated, a nonprofit organization offering heart-centered educational experiences, and the Lloyd Symington Foundation, which supports visionary grassroots cancer programs. So if you take into account the collective history, the enslaved people and being cut off from homeland and subject to terror and abuse and discrimination, and the decades that followed with all of the institutionalized racism and lack of access to quality health care for many, many years, having higher death rates among newborns, for instance, and having health disparities because of lack of access to care. And not only that, but when getting care, finding racism having an impact in terms of whether or not the healthcare practitioner took you seriously, understood you as a person, assumed things about you that were not accurate. So often we find that the people were sent home when they should have been given treatment right away. All of these kinds of things have their impact on the overall well-being. So when we are in a state of chronic stress, our brains are on alert and they're looking for threats to our survival. And the body experiences years of this chronic stress arousal. The effects, they override the normal aging process. They make our telomeres look more like they're from a significantly older person. The shortened and frayed telomeres make the body more susceptible to diseases such as heart disease and stroke and diabetes and dementia. And we need to understand that these are patterns that exist, but they are patterns that can be changed, and that we have a responsibility to make radical self-care a priority if we're ever going to change these life-diminishing dynamics. So I want to say that we start by controlling what we let in, just really knowing that there's a thin line between being informed and engaged, but not emotionally entangled. I say that we own the space around us. If you extend your arms out in both directions and make a circle, that is your sovereign space. That is your space, and you're responsible for determining what enters that space. And so we look at violence on television and in the movies, and we consume it in the news. And so we actually move from an empowered state to a state of victimhood, essentially. And we want to inform everyone that violence is like a virus that infects the mind. And watching it in all of these places and on the news and in social media, all this gratuitous violence is not helpful. So we also want to be aware of the fact that the depiction of Black people in particular as criminals and thugs, as unreliable, as dishonest caricatures undermine how we think about ourselves, how we think about each other. So my point is that we need to be in control into what we let into our minds, what we let into our consciousness. And then the second point that I would make is that we need to also unravel the messages of self-hatred that are embedded in systemic racial oppression and really look inside to see what messages you have internalized of being less than. And we actually go through this process in the Love Letters to Our Bodies workshops where we have women to take a poll and identify the kind of messages that they received early in life that may well have contributed to their experiencing the disease state. So messages come in many disguises. They come as feelings that you are unworthy, that you're undesirable. And for women, for Black women in particular, I want to say that this is really important because on these dating apps, and depending on where you are in the country, you are often presented with the notion that the least desirable choice is the African American woman. And I want you to know that for hundreds of years, the African female was considered the most desirable one on the planet. And so, but we've been in this system that sprang from colonialization to institutionalized racism and all of the conditioning that had to be put in place to make that system work. So I want you to know that if you have gotten messages about being unlovable, about being lazy or incapable, or always angry, ignorant, or not belonging, and that if you have disdain for any of your physical features, whether it's your nose, your hair, your skin color, etc., then you have internalized messages of self-hatred. And it's your job to begin to recognize that and to begin to unravel those messages. And we'll get into how we can do that as we go along in this Love Letters to Our Bodies podcast. The other thing that I want to suggest is that it's important that we examine how we communicate with others like ourselves, and also those who seem to be different from us. And I asked the question, do you use disempowering language about yourself, about your partner, your family, your community? And I asked this question because, when we use language, and I know this is going to be offensive to some people who feel like it's okay to say anything, anytime, and that we reclaim certain words and that we can use them. Well, I just wanted you to know that when we use disempowering words about ourselves, we reinforce our disempowerment. And this message I want to especially leave with women, because we have become the people who are using languages to describe ourselves that is not flattering or favorable or empowering. So I don't need to repeat those words. Just give it some thought. And I'm sure that you might be able to find some. So the question is, are you deferential to folks outside of your racial group? Are you overly defensive or abrasive? Are you constantly censoring yourself in the presence of others? So all of these things are contributors to disempowerment. And we want to be living in an empowered state. I also want to encourage you to listen to cues from your body. So, what role does food play in your life? And do you eat food that your parents and grandparents ate? And how does your body feel after you eat? And how much do you eat? And when do you choose to eat? And are you eating to nourish the body when you're hungry? Or are you eating because you're trying to stuff down emotions? If you're lonely, angry, tired, or worried, and you're eating through those emotions, you're not doing yourself any favors. What about water? Are you hydrated enough? And I'm saying water, not soda or juice. Water is the elixir that keeps the body functioning properly. And it also is the substance within our body that imprints our being and imprints our consciousness. So more about that later, but make sure that you're being hydrated. Speaking of which, I need to take a sip of water right now. How often do you connect with nature? Do you exercise, walk, run, swim, garden? Do your bare feet ever touch the ground? not the concrete, but the grass, the dirt, the silicon in the sand. We have cells in our bodies that are rechargeable batteries. They are called ATP. They are, I don't want to pronounce this, but adenosine triphosphate molecules, and that's produced by our mitochondria. It stores and transfers energy in the cells, and the sun and the electromagnetic field of the earth function to electrically charge the cells in the body and to support the circulation. And it's really good to be out in nature. Being in nature is good medicine. Align your sleep pattern with nature. That's another tip, another takeaway. So, how many hours do you sleep? When do you sleep? And I have to say that this is something that I personally struggle with and have been working on because I know better, right? In traditional Chinese medicine, for instance, there's an understanding that vital energy or qi circulates through the organs in the body in 2-hour intervals. And Google it. You can look for the traditional Chinese medicine clock. And for instance, from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., energy is focusing through the stomach. And then between 9 and 11 through the spleen, and from 11 to 1 through the heart. And let's go skip over some and go to the nighttime when often we're up late watching movies, So, like between 11 and 1, that's gallbladder time, and 1 and 3 is liver time, and 3 and 5 is lung time, and 5 and 7 a.m. is large intestine time. So, energy is circulating through these organs in this time. And when we're asleep, this is the time for the body to replenish those organs that I just mentioned, like after 11. And so there are optimum times to eat, there are optimum times to sleep, to rest, to properly regenerate the body. And these are things that we can be conscious about, we can take responsibility for, we can take hold of our health and well-being by becoming informed and taking action. The next thing that I recommend is that you feel your feelings. You can't just push them down all the time, and feeling your feelings doesn't mean that you have to go off on people or that you've got to be loud and profane or, get into fights or anything like that. But it's about becoming aware and becoming an observer of what's going on in your inner state. And, like sometimes when we feel angry, really the feeling that's hidden underneath that anger is a feeling of helplessness, inability to have our way or to enforce our will on others. And so I want you to begin to think about your own emotions and how they are showing up in your life and whether or not they pull you into depression, because you don't express them, or whether or not you're always in this fight or flight response, which is another big stressor, by the way. So think about that and know that undigested emotional traumas of the past trigger explosive emotional responses. So, like, if something happened that was really traumatic for you, whether it was when you were a child or a young adult, or whether it happened last week or last month, if those emotions aren't processed and you haven't really allowed yourself the space to feel what you really were feeling at that time, you'll find that when some other little thing happens, you might have an explosive emotional reaction. So when we can bring our awareness to what's really going on the inside, we can begin to heal. The next suggestion is that you reorient yourself to your divinity. Connect with a higher power through prayer. Historically, folks have managed to bear the unbearable by engaging in prayer and seeking divine intervention. So, I want to talk for a minute about prayer. We are creators, we're manifestors, and prayer is actually like a scientific formula for manifestation. And we'll talk about what that exact formula is in some of our podcast discussions as we go forward. But know that it doesn't mean that you have to be on your knees crying, Lordy, Lordy, help me, please. It's effective when you actually get really clear about what you want and see yourself enjoying it and asking for divine help, but from a thankful place, from a place of gratitude. We'll go into more of this later, but prayer lifts us into a higher vibration so we can access wisdom and courage. We also need to recognize that we are the sons and daughters and hands and feet of God. And I'm not talking about some man up in the sky. I'm talking about this whole process of the universe that's unfolding, the higher intelligence that caused all of this through process to come into creation. The planets, the sun, the moon, the stars, that we are made up of all of these elements and that we're part of this whole process. Our very being is a process. Our very life is a process. And so we need to have a co-creative relationship where we're active participants and we're listening closely to inner guidance. So much of our experience has been one of blaming others and failing to take responsibility for our own creation. But let me tell you, if you want to know what's going on an inner level in your mind, just look at what's going on around you. If there's a bunch of chaos, confusion, limitations, limited thinking, inability to succeed, inability to access things, yep, there's that larger picture of racism and racial discrimination. But there's another picture. There is an antidote to it. And that is becoming a sovereign being, taking possession of your creative power and using that power to create good in your life and to create what you want to manifest. And lastly, I want to encourage you to meditate. And meditation is not the total answer for spiritual progress or for creating the life that you want to have, but it's a start. And what happens in meditation is that it actually disrupts the stressors and it makes it possible for us, these stress pathways where the thinking is repetitive and constantly going on and on and on. We're ruminating over all the bad things that happen. What you really need is mystical brain surgery, but that's a topic for another day. But you can start by meditating, and it doesn't have to be complicated. You can start by taking a few minutes a day, say 5 or 10 minutes to begin with, to just pay attention to your breath, to allow yourself to sit quietly, close out the noise, and focus on your breathing. And just allow yourself to feel your breathing. And you'll begin to find that if you cultivate this kind of activity, that the stress pathways are quieter. You're not always in fight or flight, that you actually begin to create space between somebody triggering you and you're reacting. you can move into a place of responding. And that is something that will be cultivated over time, and also with the help of other really important processes, really important and beautiful spiritual processes. For instance, like experiencing bliss. There are ways to participate in circles where you can have prayer to receive a transfer of joy, of bliss, so that you can move outside of that real stressful mind that's suffering, ruminating over everything that just happened. And I'll put in the show notes where you can participate in some of these sessions at no cost. So, mindfulness, meditation, receiving bliss, joy, causeless love, and a state of oneness are tools that can really help you meet life's challenges in a way that are positive, in ways that are positive. These are things that can help you meet life challenges in ways that are positive and helpful. And it will help us to break the cycle of victimhood and illness and premature death. This practicing radical self-care and becoming sovereign beings. Becoming sovereign beings. That's my recommendation for how to meet racism with a life-affirming response. So back to the body. Your body is beautiful. Love it. I don't care what size it is, what shape it is, what color it is. I don't care what the length of your feet are, how flat they are, or how much arch you have. I don't care about the breadth of your nose, the color of your skin, the color of your eyes, the texture of your hair. Your body is a gift from God. Your body has intelligence. Your body is beautiful. Love it. So wonderful people, good people, beautiful people. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm Gwen Mitchell. You've been listening to Love Letters to Our Bodies, Conversations on Health, Healing, and Happiness, brought to you by MOYO Institute, a 501c3 organization committed to sharing heart-centered educational experiences. The Love Letters Project is possible due to a generous donation from the Lloyd Symington Foundation. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episode on Thursday. Tune in. You might learn something about health, healing, and happiness. Your body's beautiful. Love it. That's a wrap. Thank you so much for listening to Love Letters to Our Bodies, Conversations on Health, Healing, and Happiness. To find out more about the Love Letters to Our Bodies project, visit our website at moyoinstitute.org. That's MOYO Institute.org. Follow us on social media and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. If there are topics you'd like for us to discuss, let us know. Remember, your body is beautiful, girlfriend. Love it.